Famous in the room. Kevin is a professional wrestler. And we went to see him live and I bought a t-shirt, so I'm wearing it today.
Or you should show the t-shirt.
The announcement, when is it? Is it tomorrow? Next Friday?
15th of February.
15th of February.
Yeah, it's down at the Armour.
Apparently the Killer Steves of playing against, of fighting against Punisher Van Slyke and SUNY Oswego's Kevin the Man Dren. So we have an interview candidate on that day. I don't think I can bring her to the wrestling. Probably not. Right. Let me connect everything. Everyone get on all right with Canvas? All have a look at it? Any problems? It's nice, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be great if we had that instead of Angel? It really is a lot nicer, a lot easier to use. Thank you, those of you who took part in the initial discussions. Some fascinating stuff in there. Okay, so some really interesting ones, discussions. Right from the start, Brian started talking about one of the interesting things about media was the fact that we could now record media, which caused me to ask this question about being able to hear something being more beneficial in knowledge terms than reading something. You already have the knowledge, so yes, you can gain emotion in the sense, but in the knowledge terms of what is added, which started a discussion off on that, of what is read. Patrick joined in at the end about this idea, this idea of deconstruction. Among philosophy, where recording is neither speech nor writing, but in a strange way participates in aspects of both. And this causes these problems of sense and reference. And I had to say, in this last part, Patrick lost me. I wasn't sure what...
I haven't had a chance to read your reply.
Yeah, I thought, I'm not sure I grasped this last bit here, so...
Oh, sure, it was meant to do that.
Oh.
Is sense and reference something,
That's Patrick,
I had thought that was something like immersion and presence. I don't know.
The classic discussion of sense and reference is found in an essay by Frege, written in the early 20th century. And the problem has to do with phrases like the morning star and the evening star. Speaking of the morning star and the evening star, it's arrived. If I asked you what the referent is to that phrase, the morning star and the evening star, what would you say? Pardon? Oh, it was your I don't know, was it? Yeah. Venus. So when I ask this question frequently in English classes, I get the answer, the sun and the moon. And that makes some sense too, but yeah, Venus is typically called either the morning star or the evening star. So the sense of the phrase is different, even though the referent is the same.
Okay, so the sense is different even though the reference is the same. So it's more like an interpretation.
Right, so when you're saying, where's your statement earlier? I'll up it a bit. So when you say, surely in knowledge terms the sense is still there, Okay?
So you're saying it could be interpreted differently, yeah.
Well, the sense might not be there. The sense might change with the media. The referent might not even be the same. And that's a debate within this theory called deconstruction.
Okay.
Okay? So it just depends on what theory of language you use and what your understanding of words and phrases are, and the nature of predication and reference. So, so I was just kind of playing with your, see, the kind of philosophy that I love to do is called ordinary language philosophy. And rather than trying to come up with grand concepts that we then nail down and think that are permanent and unshakable, the ordinary language approach just says, let's listen to how we talk when we're thinking about ideas and see where the words kind of get us into trouble or where we're forced to talk in ways that seem strange to us. And because that's one way we can kind of foreground the assumptions that we're making. And a lot of times the assumptions that we make are sort of leftover or residual from earlier periods of thought. A very quick example of this is when the automobile was first on the scene, people didn't have the word automobile. So they started calling what we call cars horseless carriages. Okay? So the language lags behind the technology in this case. And so there are a group of historians in France who observe these kinds of things, and they say mentalities change very slowly. So that frequently the language, the vocabulary, the phrases that we have to describe what's happening with a new invention or with a new technology or new medical procedure, frequently our language is behind, it's lagging behind, it's using outdated or no longer useful phrases and terminology. It's doing its best that it can to catch up with the insight that's driving our discoveries.
And some of you may have heard of Ray Kurzweil, and he's a technology theorist, I think is the best way to describe him. I was just watching a video we're going to use in the next lecture where he talks about the inadequacies of the language we have for this technology. So exactly that concept is, I was just watching that in my office for the next class, because we're going to talk about some of the definitions of the terminology. Some of the definitions next class and some of those.
Let me send round for everyone a handout that those of you who have been my students in other classes will be very familiar with these quotations from Friedrich Nietzsche. They're very handy places where we can kind of get our bearings philosophically. And the one that I'll dwell on quite a bit is one that's in the center of a lot of discussions. It's will to power 480. It's the aphorism there under number 480. But the one that's very brief, and this one is kind of intriguing, and it speaks directly to this point. It's will to power 482. And it reads, we set up a word at that point at which our ignorance begins. So, and then his example is, at which we can see no further. For example, the word I, the word do, the word suffer. These are perhaps the horizon of our knowledge, but not truths. So it's a very strange way of talking. But the general idea is one that, we'll refine this as we go, but the general idea is that we often think if we can name something that we know it. What Nietzsche is doing in this insight is he's reversing that. And he's saying when we assign a name to something, it's actually, that's the point at which our knowledge has reached a certain kind of limit. And frequently, and I've been extending that insight a little bit, I'm saying the names that we use for things are usually words that we take from the past. And we then, and so what we do is we're restraining the use of the word, and because our knowledge has reached something like a stopping point, or a place of where non-knowing begins.
And the problem we have is that these arbitrary words are applied that aren't really appropriate, especially with new technologies.
Yeah. We do that too with sometimes we use like metaphors, right? Like a web page. It's not actually a page. And there's nothing about it that's a paper. We just call it a page. A home screen. It's not actually a home, but it's where we establish our base. You know what I mean? So,
but we've had this concept we talk about in HCI all the time about mental models.
yeah.
What is the mental model of the user? What is their familiarity? What models do they have? What experience do they have? And what can we use, either visually or textually, to make them understand, right, what the technology they're using. So yeah, you, Bobby?
I like this point.
You
No,
don't like it?
I do.
Oh, you
It
do?
always bugs me, like, looking at like how technology recently is being named, like that new, remember that tiny little Linux computer called Raspberry Pi? Like, why would you name it that? But it's like, why not? If you're just gonna make up a word out of that stuff anyway, just pick any word. It doesn't. So
There's a long history.
Maybe it's not a long. I don't know.
There's a long history of computer fruit. You know, apples, oranges, and
Apples.
yeah. So.
A lot of it is sort of off the cuff, like calling a memory card a stick. You know, I was very much struck by that. It's friendly in a way, and it's just something that's casual. But I will call it sticks. I don't like sticks.
I think we'll talk about language a little bit, and then we'll continue
It's gonna
this.
keep
I
going.
think we'll
This
move
will
into language a
Now-
bit more next one, because what I intended to do was start giving some definitions about machine intelligence,
And artificial intelligence.
consciousness, and
one of the
start doing
things-
some of the definitions next class.
Right, and one of the things that'll start to surface for us is the fascinating word artificial. Okay, and I'll have a lot to say about that, because back in Shakespeare's time and before, the word artificial meant to realize the perfect idea of something. So an artificial rose would be the perfect conception of a rose without any blemishes or flaws or blight, right? So the real rose is a copy of the perfect idea of a rose, and the perfect idea of a rose is artificial in a kind of Neoplatonic sense. So what's happened since the Neoplatonic period and the early modern period, the Renaissance, is that very word itself, artificial, has flipped its definition so that it means something that's not genuine, a cheap copy, a distorted copy, and so on. Okay. So that's one word that will come into play. Then I'll stop after this quick comment, because I know you want to get to the
that's
presentation on,
interesting.
and I want to hear what you have to say about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Because I don't know much about it. So the word model will be one that we'll have to puzzle through. Is a model a representation? Right? Maybe, right? But words and phrases don't merely represent. They also perform. They also act. So we sometimes think if something's just a copy or a representation of something, it's not really doing anything. It doesn't have any effect. It's just a representation, right? But in some very strange way, a model is actually something that has force, right? It creates consequences. It leads us to have some new ideas, or it prevents us from seeing something until we tweak it in some way. So I'll be talking about the difference fairly often between description and performance. Austin uses the phrases constantive and performative. And then he perfects this vocabulary by talking about the locutionary, the illocutionary, and the paralocutionary uses of phrases and utterances and writing. So I'll be giving you some kind of a vocabulary about language as we proceed.
But that ties in very well with the idea of virtual self, Baudrillard, and
Absolutely, yeah.
we do that in, we talked a lot about that in the games classes, this idea of simulation of worlds and the reality. So, yeah. It's going to be interesting. I'm scared to start on another one of these. Well, we'll get... Another one of the things I find fascinating about this was when I asked my students to pick a particular piece of media that was important, changed society. Many of them were ancient pieces of media, ancient texts, that whether it was the Bible or you chose a set of rules from an ancient code, or and Gil had one as well. Now that was interesting that these, I've forgotten which one we've got on. Yeah, this is the hieroglyphs and ancient writings, you know. Very interesting that people chose this as I really did expect when I asked a group of students to pick a piece of media that they don't pick Star Wars, and Kevin did. But, you know, but the fact that you're choosing these ancient forms of media I find quite fascinating, you know, that they had an impact. Yes?
Well, by that, one could argue that Star Wars isn't, in and of itself, is ancient media, and that it's, you know, it's like they say, it's an old story told new.
Joseph Campbell definition of the yeah. The same story over and over again. It was very interesting. And I also find fascinating that the English students tended to choose older technologies as well, like the combustion engine or irrigation, these kind of processes that are quite abstract and ancient but have a huge impact on society.
No one said toilet. No one said toilet.
Why didn't you say toilet?
Well, I did post up on there a link to a video which I strongly recommend watching. It's a German mathematician called Hans Rosling who gives some of the best TED Talks. And I think some of you may have you seen the one about the washing machine? Yeah. He gives a talk explaining that the washing machine is the world's greatest invention. And it's astonishingly convincing that the washing machine has changed society almost more than any other particular piece of technology. Worth watching, really is. A very convincing argument about it. So, thank you for taking part in this and doing a little bit, those that did. There's no grade for this, it's just to get you started doing things. We're going to get you working together again a little bit. What we're going to do today is I'm going to, I think we have, I'm going to, oops, don't want to do that, start from the beginning. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of artificial intelligence today, and the kind of plan is I'll talk for 5–10 minutes, then we'll let Patrick take over and guide some discussion and talk a little bit about some of the concepts this brings up, and we're going to share backwards and forwards a little bit like that. So I'll start with some concepts about artificial intelligence, about creating an intelligence other than human. And start with ancient Egypt. This, can we turn just one of the lights off at the front, Patrick? Would you mind?
Just one sec.
Just by the door, just the ones at the front, I'm not sure, other one, that's it. This statue here is in Cairo Museum of Antiquities, and we can say that the quest for artificial intelligence is as old as human civilization. There are Greek stories about artificial men. This idea of the Egyptians in the thinking machine, 2500 BC, the Egyptians had talking statues that they went to for advice. And this is one of those talking statues. It's of the god Re Harmakis, and you can work out how they got it to work. There's a hole at the back of the statue that a priest could sit inside and give advice to people who came. So it was a trick. But people wanted this. They wanted to go to a statue and get information from the statue. And a woman called Pamela McCorder wrote a very famous artificial intelligence textbook called Machines Who Think. And she talks about this desire of humans to have intelligent artifacts. And she says that artificial intelligence begins with an ancient wish to forge the gods. Now there's a whole line of discussion about whether we're still doing that, whether we're still trying to create these kind of intelligences. And back in the idea of automata, things that move, little figurines. In Tutankhamun's tomb, there were little figurines that had movable limbs, bendable joints. In the 15th century, there were all these lots of little wind-up toys or dancing figures on clocks. This idea of mechanical devices became quite prevalent. This one's from the 18th century, a wind-up drumming bear. And so what we have is artificial intelligence, this idea of creating machines that can think. It starts with classical philosophy, where we try to describe the way humans think using symbols, forms of logic. And the consequence of that was that in the 1940s we started building machines. The first computers. Computers are nothing more than symbol manipulators. They take an abstract symbol and perform a manipulation on it with another symbol. So they're the abstract essence of mathematical reasoning. So these devices inspired scientists, small groups of scientists in the 1940s started talking seriously about building human brains, about building machines that could perform the functions that humans perform. And artificial intelligence, the actual word, comes from a conference in Dartmouth College in 1956. And the people who were there became, if you like, the fathers of artificial intelligence, the people who developed the field. All these people predicted that machines, as intelligent as human beings, would exist in no more than a generation. They thought by the 1970s, 1980s, we would have human machines. And the government gave them millions of dollars to start researching this. They then stopped giving them money in the 60s and 70s, and may talk about that. Artificial intelligence research has gone through, it's called summers and winters. They've had periods where it's been very popular, then it's been funding stopped. So from the 50s, 60s, there was all this belief, and then it died off in the 70s. There was a big revival in the 80s, which is when I did my PhD in artificial intelligence. But by the time I was finishing my PhD, early 90s, it was dying off again. The research was dying off. So it comes in these, artificial intelligence has these boom and bust cycles. It's in another boom at the moment. So it's obvious that they grossly underestimated the difficulty of this. So one of the most famous systems was developed by Newell, Shaw, and Simon. One of the first artificial intelligence computer programs. 1956, one of the first ever computer programs, called the Logic Theorist. And this could derive mathematical principles. And it worked on Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica, where the philosopher Bertrand Russell went back to first principles of mathematics and reproved a lot of the very basic theorems. And what they discovered was that the actual computer could prove the theorems better than the humans could. It found new ways to prove these theorems. So suddenly, for the first time ever, we had a machine that was creating knowledge that the people who programmed the machine didn't have. So this was the first time that happened in 1956. And so this is what people were saying at the time. They thought their expectations were quite grandiose. Alan Newell said that in 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion, unless the rules bar it from competition. Only now are we seeing computers starting to beat Kasparov and people of that nature. Isaac Asimov was at the Dartmouth College conference where artificial intelligence started. And he said, he used the word cybernetics, but he said this is going to spark an intellectual revolution. And he said cybernetics is not merely another branch of science, it's a revolution that rivals the Industrial Revolution. It is possible that just as a machine can take over the routine functions of human muscle, another can take over the routine uses of the human mind. And so they imagined another prediction that by the year 1984, computers would dominate our lives. They predicted all the household robots and that teaching machines would be commonplace. And they suggested that computers will be capable of learning, conversing, translating language, and the computers would house our libraries and compose most of our music. So there is some truth in that. It's taken a lot longer than they predicted, but the idea of computers housing our libraries, this is before the internet, we now have the internet, repositories of knowledge. Translating, Google Translate does a pretty good job. Portable devices can act as translators, so we have machines that do some of these things, but they're not. I think we could argue that computers do dominate our lives nowadays. So, any feedback, comments on that, of what you thought? Chris?
Yeah, well, one of the things that when they talked about AI, you know, it was going to dominate our lives, it was going to do everything. One thing they always seemed to, back then, they didn't take into account is how truly subjective humans are. I mean, we don't necessarily follow a pattern to every little thing. If you were to ask a computer, say, you know, what is good music, it could, that idea could be based off 10,000 people, and it might still find like a, you know, one more person who doesn't fit, you know, what the computer programmed to understand that is. That probably one of the big limitations right there, you know, just personal taste and whatnot.
Subjectivity is interesting. It's a very interesting concept of individuality. But in many ways it makes intelligence, artificial intelligence, more possible, theoretically more possible, because you don't have to pick the best type of music. You can pick any type of music and say you like that. And you could still class it as intelligent if we rely on subjectivity. Patrick, do you want to?
Let's just let the students come to us.
I know I've heard the laws of robotics from iRobot, but I'm just confused. Is that like a program, beyond like a computer philosophy, like robotic philosophy thing, is that like generally accepted as like robots can't do this, or we are supposed to program robots and AI to follow the laws of robotics?
The laws of robotics are purely a science fiction thing written by Asimov in a book. So they're just rules in a novel. They're not scientific rules as such.
Okay. Stupid question, I know.
No, it's okay. So what about this idea of why do we create artificial intelligence? This idea, why would you go to a statue to get advice rather than a person?
The human might get flawed advice. The human being has biases. They can get flawed advice. If you go to a statue, you can think, well, this has been a statue its entire existence. It doesn't have its biases. Maybe it doesn't hate farmers. If it's a representation of the God itself, it's of a higher power than just some guy.
I think you've got the two things I thought. One was the representation of the God, gives it authority. I thought that would be quite important. But the idea of the impartiality is interesting. I may show you, when we start talking about natural language, I'll show you some. One of the very first artificial intelligence systems was an artificial psychiatrist, where you typed in your problems and the computer responded. And many people preferred that to talking to a real person. Why?
They don't judge you.
They don't judge you. Yeah, I don't know.
Not necessarily in response to that. Perhaps it is. I think we've been touching upon it, and I forgot to say about the textbook that you cited earlier, you mentioned it, but maybe another way to sort of describe the desire for artificial intelligence is transcendence, whether it be our own kind or, I I think that idea could apply to a number of different contexts. But the wish to transcend ourselves and sort of put it in a more contemporary context, particularly by those who are driving artificial intelligence, it's not so much a desire to engage with the gods, but just to transcend our own humanity, which ties into the partiality, the biases, and things of that sort. And that, for whatever reason, there's this desire to produce something that is beyond us, even if it overtakes us. But yeah, so transcendence was the point.
That's fascinating, and that's the crux of a lot of what we hope to talk about on this course. But yeah, absolutely, there's a desire to make ourselves better, and that's enhance ourselves in all sorts of ways. I always talk with students about having these devices in our hand. You know, it changes who we are. That we now have other knowledge suddenly there at our fingertips. Doesn't matter how that knowledge, we're seeing it through a small screen here, hearing it through an earpiece, watching it on the screen, but that knowledge is now part of us. It's with us all the time, so we're changing who we are. So this idea of transcendence, that humans are we evolving? Evolving is a difficult term, but are we evolving into something else through the use of this technology? Is it making us something else? And do we have that desire to change ourselves? Interesting. Yeah.
I think kind of going with that, I would maybe cite some sort of Freud theory and say that we're like the same way that you would maybe speak to yourself in the mirror, you're speaking to some sort of an ideal representation or seeking advice from something in pursuit of an ideal human essence or subjectivity, stumbling on the word.
So I'm not sure what you mean by when you speak to yourself in the mirror, you're trying to...
Well, for example, when they speak in the ancient Egypt, speaking to the statues, that's giving you an ideal representation, so an icon that you can speak to. So it's in the same way that you would interact with an ideal ego. You're acting out those kind of psychological necessities in order to better yourself.
There is that idea of interaction with technology, with artifacts, is interesting because obviously it's what we study, human-computer interaction. We look at how we interact with these objects. And the idea of people wanting this interaction with an artifact because it has a certain iconic representation. They have a model of something they want. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Could the very reason that that desire to seek advice from inorganic and non-human things simply be rooted in the idea that we want to essentially answer our own questions without ask questions in the presence of something remotely humanoid, so that we may or may not realize it, but if somebody asks a statue for advice, in saying that, they could theoretically answer their own question and get their own advice from their own words, and then say that that came from the gods, or that the statue answered their own questions. And really, all they were really doing is speaking to a non-human audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that...
I'm listening, I'm just trying to hear it.
Well, to me, the thing that about getting advice from a computer or a statue is that, even though the information in artificial intelligence, for example, is it came from a human at some point, or it's something that it's something that's a human is probably capable of deriving, but the thing that gives people some confidence in it is that the computer, a human has doubt, or has the capability for doubt, but a computer, if it's deterministic at least, doesn't have doubt at all. It's always going to say the same thing. It's always going to have the same thought, and so it's sort of the most confident person. People are more likely to listen to the advice of a confident person. So a computer is sort of the epitome of that.
Well, I'll give you the example. So the first thing they built was the psychiatrist. who it was actually a very simple program. It was designed just to ask questions, so people would talk to it. It didn't understand the information that was put in. It collected the information and asked more questions. That's all it did. So as soon as someone bought that, the second one that was built in response to that was someone built a patient and built paranoia into the answers. So this idea of not having doubt, oh yes, you can introduce doubt, but are you introducing a form of deterministic doubt where you know and can quantify that? Or could you put that in more unknown quantity in the machine?
I'm sorry, I think I lost you there.
So
how is doubt, how is it factored in?
Well, someone built the
artificial
paranoid, and in this particular instance, it was quite deterministic how it responded. You could actually set a grade and set the level of paranoia, which would change how the machine would respond, how paranoid the response would be.
But the machine is still responding from the position of being the analyst?
No, no, no. In this case, it's the patient. So someone built an artificial, an analyst, so of course someone else went and built an artificial patient. And there are many conversations of these things talking together, which are a bit, they don't always make sense, but they're quite interesting to look at, but you could change a lot. However, what I was saying was that the machine, the paranoid, actually answers from a set of rules. It's still a programmed response.
Just a quick comment here. I've met a few paranoid people, some suffering from serious diagnosed paranoia, and I've never met more certainty in a person. Paranoid people are sure that someone is out to get them, right?
Certainty and well-informed.
Yeah, so it's an interesting use here of how I think we're going to come back frequently to this statement that you made, that a computer does not have doubt. One of the defining moments of subjectivity in the early modern philosophy, early modern period modern philosophy, is when Descartes poses a problem for himself. He says, what is it that I know for sure? What is it that I really know for sure? And he says, I'm not really sure that I know what I know for sure. Are you familiar with this general story or general narrative? One way to tell the story, and it's not the way it's often told, goes something like this. Descartes asks himself this question, what is it that I know for sure? Well, I don't know. So let me start to doubt everything until I can doubt no longer. So doubting becomes this fundamental activity, right, where he's trying to identify the status of his knowledge. So he begins by saying, I can doubt what my senses provide for me, because if my senses deceive me in some things, they may deceive me in all things. So anything that I know that is somehow relying upon sense perception, I need to doubt, I need to set it aside. So I have to doubt that I have a body, because how do I know I have a body? It's because I can see it, and I can touch it. So I'm going to doubt my body, I'm going to doubt that you exist, of course, I'm going to doubt that this room exists. The one thing that I cannot doubt, Descartes realizes, is that he's doubting. And but there's really no he there to be doubting. So he basically says, what I know for sure is that I'm a doubting thing, right? So the phrase, the famous phrase in the Latin text is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But the word that precedes that, the thought that precedes the cogito, is the word dubito. I doubt. Doubting is a kind of thinking, and it's because I'm doubting, and that's sort of the evidence of my thinking, I think, therefore I am. Well, what is it that I am? Descartes describes that phrase, I am, that I'm using here, as a res cogitans. The word res in Latin just means a thing, anything, an ordinary thing. So I'm a thinking thing. Now, for Descartes, the only thing that he knows for sure at this moment in the meditation, the only thing that he knows for sure is that he's a thinking thing. He doesn't know that he has a body. He doesn't know that he is extended in space. Okay? That's the bedrock. But if you think about it more carefully, what's happened in the terms of the tradition of philosophy, everybody says, oh, the bedrock of subjectivity is this idea of the res cogitans, of the thinking thing. But if you actually put it in the context of Descartes' writing, the thing that all thinking things have in common, if you want to put it that way, is that we're all doubting. That doubting is really the fundamental activity here that becomes the experience, or the primary experience of thinking. So we'll play around with that. That's only one very brief way, somewhat distorted way of reading Descartes. These are well-worn, deeply interpreted texts. So I'm putting a little bit of a spin on it. But a lot of times when people following in this line of thought would try to identify a common or a universal human essence or a universal human nature, they say that it's our thinking, our rationality that makes us a specific kind of animal, a rational animal. Okay? But if we think about it, and we interpret that Cartesian meditation in a slightly different way, then what we all have in common isn't that we're rational, it's that we're doubting. Right? It's the activity of our doubting. Now, doubting is a word full of negative connotations. So we could find another word for doubting. We might say we're wondering, right? We're curious, right? And with our wonder and our curiosity, there's a certain kind of openness to possibility. Why? Because we don't have that experience of knowing which closes things off, right? So the activity of doubting is open to a future. So this becomes a temporal problem for us. We're that kind of being that is in time. We exist in time in a way that might be different from other kinds of beings that we don't know, that we don't share something with. Okay, that's a quick, and we can explore this in many different ways. We can actually, if you want, read some of these foundational texts that I'm referring to, so that, you're not just getting these things kind of spun in my direction. Yes.
I just want to say one quick thing. Sure. That's interesting because I did some research on virtual reality, and one of the hardest difficulties of creating a real, like a perfect virtual reality simulation is a person is always aware that they're in a virtual reality simulation, so you're never like fully submersed into it.
Say that again. A person is always aware.
They're aware that no matter what the technology is, they're aware that they're in a virtual reality simulation.
You guys hear in the back?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like, it doesn't matter what technology you use, you're always going to know, oh, this is a virtual reality thing. So you never actually fully like get into like in the matrix. Like, oh, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, and that's because a person always knows it's out. That's pretty interesting.
Okay. I'll have to think more about that because I've never thought about it in those terms. Yeah.
Well, that notion that humans doubt, the human mind is always doubting or wondering or whatever. Doesn't that sort of take the idea of the artificial intelligence into question? Because computers, they operate on a binary. Most programming languages, at the very least, are settled in basic logic, binary, yes or no. There isn't any yes, no, or maybe. There isn't any sort of, computers don't necessarily, at their most basic level, they don't ask more than, is this present, yes or no? And there is no, well, yes it is, but why is it present? It's sort of straightforward. So if that's the case, how can computers wonder? How can computers ever possibly become artificial humans without having that sense of wondering or doubting?
Well, firstly, computers don't work on binary systems simply anymore. There's a lot more to them than that. So the idea, and they don't work on just Boolean logic. We work on all sorts of other predicate logics now, which replicate human thought and thought. We will talk about some of those technologies, but so it's not as reductionist a question as that. It's not simply phrased as that. I think you want to answer. I can see you chomping at the bit to answer that.
So I guess one thing, like, if you want to think about logic, there's this thing called fuzzy logic. You work in between 0 and 1, and you work in the infinite amount of points between 0 and 1. So you have infinite, I guess, infinite cardinality, right, in this system that you can see infinity, but it's not actually there. And you work within that, and that's like what neural networks are, I guess, right? I mean, that's where researching neural networks goes. Like working in between 0 to 1 with a cardinality of infinity between 0. So you can have 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 all the way to n to like.
It's like Zeno's paradox, right?
Yeah. But also the question of computers having the wonderment or any of the doubt or whatever phrase we want to use is one of the core problems of artificial intelligence. Context, intentionality, whatever you want to call it, the idea of the basic question is, can a machine ever be aware, understand why it's doing something? It is a very core question. So,
I guess my one question, does artificial intelligence necessarily have to be ascribed to computers or digital machines? I mean, because there's a whole Coco and Washu, the two gorillas, where they taught them sign language, but they didn't really learn sign language. They were just, they do this and they get a tree, you know? Yeah. So it's not that, right? Yeah, so it's more Skinner than classical conditioning, like Trish said. So is it, I guess, I don't know, artificial, still funny.
I don't know that the gorillas are artificial.
But
is it gorilla artificial? That's a good
question. Because it's like anthropomorphism. We're like, oh, okay, this is a monkey and this is dealing with me.
Well,
but I'm ascribing what I know to the monkey, and the monkey is then doing it. Oh, sorry, great ape is doing it.
Politically correct term for monkey.
Well, I mean, the gorilla learning the ape learning sign language from an instructor with trees and stuff. I mean, that's the same as any animal learning any activity, right?
Right.
Any behavior. So I mean, I don't think that the apes learning sign language is if that's artificial intelligence, then so is all animal behavior, because it's not any different.
Why not?
Well, why? You first.
Well, because that you're programmed, in essence, you're programming the animal that it's not an intelligence that the animal, the organism, could derive for itself, but it is a program, right? For lack of an instructor.
It is driving it for itself. Again, the same. I mean, it's just the only thing that's different is its environment now, and its environment involves people in lab coats giving them treats. But it's still the same as any other.
But at least as far as we know, apes can learn sign language the way, like, our sign language.
No, that's true.
So that's a specific type of knowledge, if we want to say it's a specific type of human knowledge, that is artificially being imposed or instructed or programmed into beings that are able to learn it, but not necessarily know what they're doing. Which goes back to the question, can computers be aware?
I guess this is a crucial concept in artificial intelligence, because often, whenever we talk about artificial intelligence, we immediately jump to Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator. Can we create this, something that is fully human conscious? But what we're often dealing with is much simpler problems. Is this activity intelligent? And we're looking at specific activities. Is playing chess intelligent? If you can play chess, are you intelligent? If you can do sign language, are you intelligent? And that the actual goalposts, the boundaries, keep getting moved. We keep changing our definitions of what we see as intelligent. Up until 50 years ago, it was believed a computer could never play chess because it was a uniquely human experience. And if you could make a computer play chess, you had an intelligent computer. Now you can go into Best Buy and buy a computer that you will never beat at chess. So what's changed? We've moved the boundaries. You don't buy that machine and think, wow, this is an it has more human